Today's survey question was inspired by my next guest who wrote a terrific essay for Smerconish.com. Should all states adopt open primaries in which candidates must face all registered voters instead of only registered partisans? Coincidentally, just saw a press release today from a Pennsylvania state representative whose name is Jared Solomon, a Democrat who represents a portion of the city of Philadelphia. Solomon introduces legislation to bring open primaries to Pennsylvania. Here's part of his argument. In 2018, over 1.2 million Pennsylvanians were not affiliated with either major party. This is an average of 8% increase since 2014. Every year, these numbers continue to grow. In fact, right now, unaffiliated is the fastest growing political identification in the Commonwealth. That's what we call independence in this state. I'm in that unaffiliated category. What's interesting about the release, and I'm encouraged by this, is that there's also a letter attached here of support to open primaries, the idea of open primaries, and it is signed by T.J. Rooney and Alan Novak, former heads of the Pennsylvania Democratic and Republican parties, respectively. So I'd like to think that it's got a real shot. John Opdycke is the president of the appropriately named Open Primaries, and he joins me now. Hey, John, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the great essay that you co-authored for my website.
Glad to be here, Michael. I'm really, really excited to talk about these issues. They're very important. Thanks for having me on.
Let's begin with the election of 1978 and the candidacy of Philip Hackbarth. How did he beat you?
He threw. That was me running for a secretary of my third grade class, and he did the time-honored technique of throwing lollipops to the voters, and I think he won with probably 80% of the vote.
You know, when I read that, it brought back such a slew of memories, and I'm sure that callers and listeners right now can remember an election in which they ran in grade school. My favorite is that I had a really good buddy at a crosstown high school in the 10th grade who put up an enormous poster that encouraged people to vote for him for sophomore, SOFTMORE, class president. It became a huge joke. He didn't mean it as a joke, and he ended up winning in a landslide.
There you go. Grade school elections can be very, very unpredictable.
So I'm sure there's a transition there somewhere, but I don't know what it is. Look, I think that at a time when more in the country, I gave you the Pennsylvania data, but more in the country regard themselves, according to Gallup, as I's than R's or D's, it's time. Make the case.
Well, here's a transition. Ironically, there's actually more fluidity, more openness, more potential for innovation in grade school elections than there are in our elections. I mean, right now you can predict the outcome of congressional elections with 99% accuracy based purely on, the party history in that district. Things are on lockdown between the Democrats and Republicans. They've divided up the country, and that's despite the fact that the largest and fastest growing segment of the electorate are people like you and I who are saying we don't want to be a member of a political party. We're independent. We want to support the best policies, not join a team. But our political system is set up to incentivize candidates to win their offices by pandering to smaller and smaller blocks of party-controlled voters. And that's a problem that we have to address as a country.
You argue that partisan primaries represented a significant advancement 100 years ago. What's the history?
Sure. So back, think to the progressive era, the Teddy Roosevelt era, decisions were made by tiny handfuls of party leaders in smoke-filled rooms. Party primaries were an attempt to bring some sunlight into that, to allow party activists and voters to have a say in who got the Democratic nomination, the Republican nomination, who were the delegates at the conventions, and that was very positive. The issue now is that that's been flipped on its head. It's been manipulated so that the party primaries are not opportunities for the voters to shape the conversation early on. They're ways in which small blocks of highly organized partisan factions determine who wins, but more than that, they completely control how issues are talked about in this country. And if you veer outside the lines of what's politically correct, whatever you define as politically correct, there's a right version of that, there's a left version of that. If you break those lines, you're in real trouble. And we saw that on January 6th. What President Trump and his sons were telling Republicans is, you better cleave, you better adhere to the position that this election was stolen from me, or else there's going to be hell to pay. And 147 Republicans voted to not accept the results of a clearly fair and well-conducted election, precisely because they fear that kind of retribution from the former president.
So distinguish between an open primary and a public primary, and for which are you advocating, or maybe both?
Sure. We kind of use the terms interchangeably. Essentially, an open primary is where an independent voter can participate in a Democratic or Republican primary. But that's not the game changer. That's not the big change. The big change is getting rid of party primaries altogether, which we've already done in 4 states: California, Washington, Nebraska, and now Alaska. The voters just passed it this year. In a public primary, there's no more partisan primaries. There's one primary ballot. All the candidates are on that ballot. All the voters get the exact same ballot and can choose from among any candidate they want for each office. And then the most popular vote getters in California, Nebraska, and Washington, that's the top 2. In Alaska, it's the top 4. They go from the primary to the general election. And what that does is it literally completely changes how you run for office and what kind of choices you have as a voter. In a public primary system, candidates are incentivized to reach out to voters that aren't in their own party, that aren't part of their little world. And you see how much that changes how they run for office and how they govern once they're elected. And voters like this. Voters prefer, hey, I might be a Democrat, but in the primary, I might want to vote for a Republican or a Green or a Libertarian or an Independent. I want to have the full option of candidates in front of me. So it's a very big and significant advance over where we are now with party primaries.
In the public primary, do I, as a voter, nonetheless get to see that John Opdycke is registered as an I or registered as an R or a D? Is that information that's still shown to me?
It varies. In California, Washington, and Alaska, yes, candidates list their party affiliation next to their name on the ballot. In Nebraska, they have a completely nonpartisan legislature. You just run, you put your name there. And in fact, when you serve in the legislature in Nebraska, they don't have party caucuses at all. It's a completely nonpartisan system.
So how many states are like my home state of Pennsylvania that are a traditional closed primary state?
There's 12 states that prevent independent voters from voting at all. They just say you're not allowed to participate. Then there's a number of other states like Arizona that allow independents to vote in some primaries, but not, for example, they can't vote in the presidential primary. Mm-hmm. Other states like South Dakota, Utah, Nebraska, they have closed primaries, but one of the parties, in that case the Democratic Party, allows independents to vote in their primaries. The Republican Party of Maryland and Connecticut did that back in the last decade, but they've since closed it. So it's a real hodgepodge of rules and regulations. They fluctuate year to year. The parties also have a lot of leeway. Even if the law says it's a closed primary, they can still open it up. So it's very confusing. It's outdated. The country just needs to move to a system of these are publicly funded primaries. The taxpayers pay for them. They should be open to all voters, and voters should be able to vote for whoever they want. That's what we're working on.
You know, it reminds me of term limits in that the data that I've seen over the years suggests that people want term limits. The problem is that in order to bring that about, we need the very people who will be impacted by this to get on board. I said in introducing you that I was heartened by the fact that the former heads of the Pennsylvania Democratic and Republican parties are now for open primaries. Maybe that represents some degree of change, because the people being protected by this system are the ones who are in office right now.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, we first of all, we're taking advantage of ballot referendums to go directly to the people. But the Pennsylvania case is very interesting. Mr. Rooney and Novak were part of an effort to pass a bill that got through the Pennsylvania Senate last year with a vote of 42-8 for open primaries. And part of why that passed is that you have Democratic and Republican legislators who can't do anything. They can't pass a bill because so many of their colleagues get elected in these low turnout closed primaries and non-competitive general elections, and they have no incentive to govern. They have no incentive to reach across the aisle and work on hard, thorny issues. All they're doing is playing to the base. So I think we're entering into a new era, a new moment when we could bring together insiders, legislators from both parties, with grassroots forces, outsiders, advocates, and say, hey, this system doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work for people wanting to do their jobs in legislatures and in Congress. It doesn't work for the voters, and it doesn't work for the country. And that's my hope, that we can make that happen in the next 10, 20 years.
John, what would you say to a critic who says, wait a minute, you're a bunch of interlopers. If you don't like what's going on in the Republican or Democratic Party, then you should join and change from within and not try and attack the current status with this sort of initiative?
I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for that argument. I think that the parties, they are private organizations. The parties should be allowed to conduct their business and decide their priorities as every private organization in America is. The problem is that that's not what the primaries are. The primaries are taxpayer-funded, publicly administered elections. So the parties can't have their cake and eat it too. If they want to be private associations, don't ask the taxpayers to fund their private elections. The primaries should be what they are: publicly funded, publicly administered, and open to the public elections. They should not be private elections. That's my response to that.
I'm embarrassed based on what you just told me that I don't know the answer to this. Has it been litigated? Have you tried through the courts to bring about change?
Yes, we have, and we've gotten, derailed in New Jersey and in New Mexico. We brought that taxpayer funding issue in New Mexico into state court, and the judge issued arguably one of the most brilliant rulings I've ever read, in which he was so vague. He didn't rule against us, but didn't rule for us, and basically kicked us down to a lower court. So it's not really been adjudicated. And in fact, we're looking to get into both state and federal court on this issue in the upcoming year, looking at both a taxpayer funding issue. There are anti-donation clauses in many state constitutions that say you can't use public money for private purposes. But also we want to make a federal claim using some of the recent Supreme Court rulings on issues of forced association. Why should any American citizen be required to join a private organization in order to vote in a publicly funded election? That's forced association, and we're hoping to bring that forward.
Love that argument.
Something too. My colleague Jeremy Gruber and I recently completed a research paper looking at the rise of independent voters, and this is something you talk about frequently. What we found, which I think is so important to your listeners to know, is that the number of Americans who are leaving the political parties is not just growing, it's accelerating. There is a exodus from the political parties, and it is completely misunderstood, it's understudied, and it's underappreciated. I'm sure you've seen these polls that are done by pundits and kind of Washington insiders, where what they do is they say, Yes, 45% of Americans identify as independents, but they're not really independents.
Right.
They're
Yes.
Democratic leaners.
Right. Yep.
They're Republican leaners because that's how they vote. Leaving aside,
Right.
what other choices do you have on Election Day?
Right.
And part of what I think, people like yourself, Michael, that are pushing back against the kind of partisan understanding of the world, part of what we have to do is we have to lead a conversation that independents we're not in the middle between the Democrats and Republicans. We're people that are rejecting the partisanization of progress, the partisanization of public discussion and debate and policy. We are people that don't like how the political parties insist that every issue in this country has to be evaluated through the lens of which party will benefit. That really hurts us as a country. But you talk about this a lot, how independents are often regarded as soft. We're kind of mushy. I think it has to do with understanding that independents are in the middle. And I don't think we are in the middle. I think we are rejecting a whole way of doing politics. And we have to put some muscle, we have to put some meat on the bone for that new understanding.
Yeah, and people need to be passionate about the issues that you're describing. Hey, John, that was excellent. Really terrific. Thank you for taking the time to write. Thank you for taking the time to be here and speak. I'll just say this. So often I'll get a telephone call from someone who'll say, well, okay, you've convinced me, but what are we going to do about it? Well, here's a great example of something tangible that I really do believe would bring about change. If more of us could vote in open primaries or public primaries, I think we'd be on our way to electing more of the type of people that you're describing. So thank you. I appreciate it very much and hope our paths cross again.
One quick plug, please, every one of your listeners, go to our website, openprimaries.org. Read this new report on the rise of independence. It will blow your mind. We have to get this out to every newspaper, journalist, academic in the country because it's fundamentally that the American people.
I'm going to put it in my Twitter feed. I'm going to put it in my Twitter feed right now and make it as easy as we can. Okay. Thank you, John.
Michael.
Much obliged. I should add that David Jolly and Patrick Murphy, you remember them? Both former members of Congress. They were here recently. They wrote this book that was just phenomenal. Co-editors of Divided Union, Structural Changes to Bipartisanship in America. And Misters Jolly, Murphy, and Opdycke together penned this piece that is published today at Smerconish.com, right now in my Twitter feed, all about the need for open primaries. And now you know why this is my survey question today. Should all states adopt open primaries in which candidates must face all registered voters instead of only registered partisans? I mean, my state and a person like me is Exhibit A because I'm closed out. And I knew this. I was a Republican from 1980 through 2010, a reliable Republican up until the 2008 election. And then in 2010, for me, when I was making a decision to renew my driver's license, I remember it because a son who is now in college accompanied me that day. And you go through a routine set of questions when you're renewing a driver's license in Pennsylvania. At least you did then. Are you registered to vote? Yes, I'm registered to vote. And I appreciate that. Although I've always wondered why they ask the follow-up question, which is, do you care to change your registration? Wow, that's really interesting. That has to be like someone providing direction to say, here are the questions, here are the statements. Anyway, in my case, when they said to me, do you want to change your registration? I said, I do. And with that son who is now a sophomore in college, I let him push the button. And pushing that button is what formally made me unaffiliated in the Commonwealth. I know some of you will say, well, as I pointed out to John, join the party if you want to change the party. But I think he has the better response, which is, wait a minute, I'm funding. What was the line from Ronald Reagan? I paid for this microphone, Mr. Breen. Well, I paid for this election. Why are you forcing me to join a party in order to exercise the franchise? That's not right. Good for you, California, Washington, and Nebraska and Alaska for doing it differently.